Thank you for that, Claire. And thank you to Jen Vic for organising this forum. It's great that we can come together and continue to have important discussions like the one we're going to have today. Let me start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi-Wurrrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose unceded sovereign lands we are on today. I acknowledge and pay my respects to their ancestors and elders. And I also want to acknowledge my mob, the Gamilaroi people, and my elders and ancestors, because without them, I wouldn't be where I am today. The thing about acknowledgements, though, is sometimes I feel uncomfortable doing them. It's not because I don't think that they should happen. They absolutely should. But for me, it's like having to publicly share something that is normally a private interaction between me, the land, and the old people. I do this everywhere I go, as it is protocol. So sharing that moment with a bunch of people I don't know very well doesn't always sit very well with me. It's not that different for Aboriginal people in most situations, though. We are expected to give our cultural knowledge, share our practices and intellect in the workplace or on the internet or just anywhere, free of charge or over and above what our regular duties require of us. And a thank you for sharing should be payment enough. We shouldn't just be acknowledging country without a depth of understanding about what took place here. Why that is important and what it means to acknowledge that in full. As I said, we do this because it's cultural protocol. And this is being shared by Aboriginal people for that protocol to be acknowledged and respected. This was not designed by our mob to be a PR exercise. And in many ways, it's used like that these days. Similarly, the Aboriginal artwork on display in many offices does not substitute for cultural safety in the workplace. And when I say Aboriginal people here, know that I'm mostly referring to the work of Aboriginal women. Not to exclude our men in this conversation, but as an Aboriginal woman, that is the place that I speak from. You all know about the gender pay gap, yeah? Well, you may or may not be so familiar with the cultural knowledge pay gap, which basically means people of colour are having to do twice as much thinking and emotional labour for half the pay, or a lot of the time no pay at all. Asking Aboriginal people to be on advisory groups or engage in consultations without remuneration is just one example of this. I don't know of another space where organisations would engage a consultant without expecting to pay them. And advisory groups should not be the default to make up a shortfall in Indigenous staff within your organisation. If this is occurring where you are, then it should raise questions about whether or not your organisation should even be doing that particular bit of work in the first place. My intention today is to talk about some things that we don't usually talk about or say out loud in a public forum. But Aboriginal women have been talking about these things and saying these things repeatedly for decades. So I figured it was time to have that conversation out loud. Because a lot of this stuff we just have between ourselves. These are the things that we talk about. Because we know about these systemic issues that contribute to these problems. Non-Indigenous people are often fearful of taking that extra step. The fear of doing or saying the wrong thing is often used as an excuse to not do anything. That silence and passivity makes the problem worse. This is not to say that Aboriginal women need saving. What we need is to be able to exist in a society that isn't continually perpetrating racism or still debating about its very existence. As Dr. Chelsea Bond so perfectly describes the process of truth-telling, this is not about whether blackfellas can be courageous to tell it, rather whether non-Indigenous peoples will be able to hear it, whether there is a willingness to shift beyond feelings to a commitment to shifting how power operates. This is hard work, but one that I can assure you, the blackfella in your organisation, that lowest paid one, turns up each day working tirelessly to undermine it. And I can also assure you, shifting relationships of power from the bottom rung is much harder than simply talking about it. Talking about the truth and acknowledging it is just step one. What is needed is action. What that action looks like depends on a willingness to redistribute power. It's all well and good to want to be an ally, but replacing the patriarchy with well-meaning white women is not the answer. The issues we face are broader than gender equality. Being equal to men, yet still living under a system of colonial oppression, is not what liberation is. And for women who are not white in Australia, we are still a very long way from even having equality, whatever that looks like, as women. The same system that creates inequality for women is the same system that racially discriminates, that is ableist, heteronormative, and xenophobic. Intersectionality is not diversity in your offices, although it cannot be considered effectively without it. What sits above and within these differing forms of oppression and discrimination is a system of power that enables and enacts it. Rather than just looking side to side and trying to consider other points of view, we also need to look at the source. Where is this coming from? And what role are you playing in enabling these systems of structural oppression to continue to exist? Who is responsible for doing something about it after having identified it? It is not only about hearing the voices of those women who live these experiences. You must actively do the thing that is being asked of you by those women. Otherwise, it's just another day in the colony. We can't have a meaningful conversation about ending violence against women without talking about racism and other forms of discrimination. Racism is, in and of itself, a form of violence. Listening to the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women is imperative, and keeping the sovereignty of Aboriginal people at the core of the work we do in prevention is a fundamental aspect of doing this work the right way. Ultimately, what we do to support and benefit Aboriginal women benefits everybody. If the system becomes easier to navigate for those at the margins, it consequently creates space for others too. The big question now is, how do we do that? What we understand about systems is that they accomplish what they have been designed to do. If a system is violent, then that is what it has been designed to do. Transformative systems change is an intentional process designed to fundamentally alter the components and structures that cause a system to behave in a certain way. These systems frequently have elements of discrimination and oppression built into them, because that's how they maintain their power. It's not always obvious to those that it doesn't impact directly, and those impacts often creep in over time or are framed in such a way that at first glance it sounds like a benefit to most people. However, it is the system itself that gets to define benefit, who the beneficiaries are, and who is excluded from benefiting at all. In Changing the Picture, we talk about colonisation as a system of oppression that deliberately creates a series of structural and institutional inequalities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We talk about how this intersects with gender inequality, but also how gender inequality is a component of colonialism. What this system does is blame the individual for their circumstance, and it does this very well. It is a technique used to hide its actual operation and avoid scrutiny and accountability. Our work should ultimately be about fundamentally transforming these systems, about figuring out how individuals and organisations and groups work separately but together. Part of this being the need to figure out exactly how the system itself is operating and for what purpose. This requires individuals and institutions to work together across a variety of settings in a lot of different ways, but like Claire said, toward the same goal. This strengthens the impact of different prevention initiatives and shifts the burden of having to do all this work from those most impacted by it in a mutually reinforcing way. At present, the system would have us all fight each other for the same small bucket of dollars needed to do this work. This one mechanism that is used to claim it is attempting to solve the problem while simultaneously creating barriers to addressing the issues and assuring that it retains power and splits those who are working against it, thereby undermining the possibility of transformative change. Other processes that contribute to this include short-term funding cycles, competitive tendering processes. The Indigenous Advancement Strategy is a perfect example of this. A funding stream that was set up by the federal government to support Indigenous projects to close the gap. Large amounts of that funding were then given to non-Indigenous organisations, taking funding directly out of the hands of Aboriginal organisations and flying in the face of principles such as self-determination and being Indigenous-led. For any of this to work and work effectively, education and truth-telling about history in this country is imperative. Acknowledging that, for the most part, feminism in Australia has been for the white woman, and that issues outside a purely gendered lens have been put into the too hard basket. Changing the Picture talks about principles of self-determination and Indigenous leadership being at the forefront of this work. Again, the question here is, how do we do that? Because it's all well and good to write about these things and to talk about these things, but how do we actually do that thing? There have been many that have come before me that have spoken about this and have been doing this work for a very long time. And if you don't know who they are, I suggest you do some homework. I don't have all of the answers and I don't presume to be the expert. What I do know is that I would like to have less of the "we told you so" conversations, and more conversations that demonstrate a willingness to act on good intentions and allyship, that provide a platform for the change that is required of not only individuals, but of the system as well. It is Aboriginal women in the Northern Territory that warned of the dangers and damage that the NT intervention would do. 10 years later, they are the ones saying "we told you so." 5 years ago, Aunty Jenny Munro set up the Tent Embassy in Redfern protesting the sale, 99-year lease of the block to build international student housing. And on the weekend just gone, social media was awash with posts of people saddened by the loss of the iconic Aboriginal flag mural as it was finally bulldozed to make way for the continuing gentrification of Redfern. I have no doubt Aunty Jenny would be saying "I told you so." That outrage and that support needs to be channeled to when Aboriginal women are talking to you and asking you to act, not with the "I'm sorry that happened," because that's what prevention work is supposed to be. The way the health, legal, education and other systems influence each other shows that these systems do not work in isolation. If we have high numbers of young Aboriginal people filling our prisons, it's because the system is designed in such a way that that outcome is the most likely. So it should be no surprise that a system designed and built on violence results in 1 woman a week being killed. Aboriginal men, women and children's overrepresentation in prisons, death and ongoing trauma are the consequence of a system built on violence. The Vic government is currently talking about negotiating a treaty, while the Woi-Wurrrung mob stand on the front line in front of bulldozers trying to save sacred trees. These things don't occur as a random byproduct. They are the end product of a system built on a foundation of colonialism and genocide. It is obvious that we have a long way to go in understanding the systemic barriers we face in this country. Those are just a few examples of the way that that system plays itself out in all manner of ways in the lives of Aboriginal people. All of us carry trauma, whether it be our own personal experiences or intergenerational trauma, from experiences of our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. And yet we stand in front of you, ready to continue to fight to stop that. There's a strength in that, and that's where our focus needs to be. We can talk about the horrifying statistics, but what we don't talk enough about is the strength of Aboriginal women in this country and our ability to just get back up and keep going no matter what is thrown at us. Understanding how systemic oppression and discrimination operates and how that plays out differently for different groups of people across society is not something that can be achieved overnight. Figuring out where each of us is situated within that system is just one element. Knowing how we each do our part and work together to dismantle these systems is how we set about changing the picture. Thank you.